Hello everybody. So this is the video that you guys had been promised about calculating cardiac output and that sort of thing. Yes, this means that there is going to be some math in this video. Bear with me here. We're all going to get through this okay. Right? Up front, you will have one singular math question like this on your upcoming exam. There will be one question where you need to calculate something, but only one, so don't panic on me. Y'all can do this. Right? So before we can just start in with all of this math stuff, we have to remember some of the other things we've talked about, and we need to understand some things. So a couple of things to note and remember all of this, right? We know that systole is the period of contraction, so when your heart is contracting. Diastole is your period of relaxation, that's when the chambers are filling up with blood, right? We've been over our cardiac cycle in a few videos now, right? Your cardiac cycle is the period of time that begins with the contraction of your atria, and it ends when your ventricles finally relax. So we have this nice little, three-step thing that we've been through: your ventricular filling phase, when all of the valves are open, blood is just flowing from the atrium down into the ventricles. Your atria then contract to squeeze out the last bit of blood down into your ventricles because the SA node fired off. And then you have the ventricular systole phases, where you have, at one singular point, isovolumetric contraction. Iso means equal. Volumetric, volume, so equal volume contraction phase. So at this point, the ventricle starts to squeeze in, and then the ventricles hard squeeze to push blood through the aorta and through the pulmonary trunk. And then you have your isovolumetric relaxation phase, which is your moment of relaxation that's in early diastole, where blood is starting to refill, but all of the valves are still closed. And then during ventricular filling, those AV valves open again, and then we cycle back to the beginning. So you have this lovely change in volume between your end diastolic volume and your end systolic volume that's in your ventricles, with your stroke volume being the total amount of blood that is pumped from your ventricles. And here's how your pulse pressure reads, right? So you have all of these lovely pulses. You've seen every single one of these charts before. This is just your lovely picture for putting it all together for your cardiac cycle, right? So we know that your blood flow is governed almost entirely by changes in pressure, right? We are squeezing blood through your heart as though they are ketchup bottle type pressures, right? So blood flow is governed entirely by changes in pressure. Your blood flows down the pressure gradient through any opening. It's going to flow like a regular liquid, right? So pressure changes reflect contraction and relaxation in your myocardium, so that's systole and diastole. Your pulmonary circuit, we already know because the lungs are right next door, and this is talking about your pulmonary veins and arteries. The pulmonary circuit has lower pressure because it's closer. It doesn't need as high of a pressure, but the ventricles have the same volume that they are pumping. Just because the muscles are stronger on the left to increase the pressure higher to get blood all the way to your toes doesn't mean the volume of liquid from both of your ventricles is different. So at any given point in time, the blood that is in the pulmonary circuit, or being pumped to the pulmonary circuit, has the same volume that the heart is pumping out to your body, right? And we also know, right, just from a little bit of common sense and other things, wherever there is more space, there's going to be less pressure. You feel less anxiety when there are fewer people around you, for example. So when the chambers are filling, that means there's space in the heart for blood to fall in. There's less pressure there, right? So as the chambers are filling, there's less pressure because it's empty. But when there is a lot of blood in the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricles is a little bit higher because you don't have as much empty space, right? Liquids and blood want to flow to places where there are less pressure. That's how flowing down a pressure gradient works, right? Right? So we've already learned about all of these lovely things. We know that our pulmonary circuit is shorter in length than the systemic circuit, so it's going to have a lower pressure. Blood doesn't have to go far to get to the lungs next door. But there's going to be more resistance in your systemic cycle. You're going to have to overcome more things like gravity or potentially clogged arteries, you sitting on your foot because you're sitting cross-legged in a wheelie chair, that kind of thing, in order to get blood through the systemic circle or circuit from your heart all the way down to your toes or up to your brain and back again. Right? This is why the anatomy of these ventricles reflects the difference, right? Your left ventricle is always going to have a thicker myocardium or muscular wall than the right ventricle does, because the left ventricle has to pump blood further. Right? So now we get into what the importance of all of these different things that you can calculate, right? So we remember mentioning EDV, or end diastolic volume, right? Right? We remember these sort of terms. You also have a stroke volume, which is the total amount of blood that your ventricles can pump. If we're going to try to figure out how to calculate all of this, we need to understand why this is important, right? We care about stroke volume because this is how efficient your heart is, right? We know from up here that your stroke volume is the total amount of blood, and diastolic volume is the amount of blood that was filling your ventricles, and systolic volume is the amount of blood left in your ventricles after your heart beats. We want this number to be as close to full as possible, and this number to be as close to empty as possible to make things as efficient as possible, which is what your stroke volume is, right? That means there's going to be three major factors that are going to affect your stroke volume, which is how efficient your heart is, right? So you have three major factors for your stroke volume. Preload is a big factor. That is the degree of stretch of cardiac muscle cells before they can contract. That is also called your Frank Starling law of the heart. I would know what that term means. That is Frank Starling's mechanisms, or Frank Starling's law. The force is directly proportional to the initial length of the muscle fiber, right? That means that the more your heart can stretch, the more blood it can hold, which is going to affect the preload, or how much initial blood can fit in your ventricles. If for some reason something has happened and the muscle fibers in your heart they can't stretch out anymore, so they don't stretch and you can't hold that much blood, you're going to have some problems, right? So that means your cardiac muscles exhibit a length-tension relationship. That means it's like a rubber band. You know that you have power and strength building up in your rubber band if you're holding a rubber band and you stretch it out. You haven't fired it off at someone yet, even though your sibling may be on the couch next to you and you really want to pop them with it. But all of that tension is still in that rubber band before you let go of it and release it at your sibling, right? Same deal with your heart muscles. So your cardiac muscle exhibits a length-tension relationship. That means at rest, just like a rubber band, your cardiac muscle cells are going to be shorter and an optimal length because they're at rest, right? Just like your rubber band. If you have a slow heartbeat or exercise, slow heartbeat and exercising increase venous return. That's the amount of blood coming back to your heart and your veins. If you have a slower heartbeat, that means your heart is beating strongly, methodically, and you tend to have increased volume for all of this returning blood. Your ventricles with slower heart rates have more time to fill up on blood, right? If you have increased venous return, that's going to stretch out your ventricles because you have more blood returning to your heart, and that's going to increase your contraction force. Just like a rubber band, you have more blood stretching out the heart muscle fibers and stretching out the rubber band. That means it's going to be able to fire off stronger and better, just like when you finally let go of that rubber band, right? Your heart can receive more blood with increased venous return, so that means it's going to be able to stretch further, and then when it finally contracts, it's going to be able to contract and push more blood out of it. That means that if you have increased venous return and your heart is beating slowly, the preload is going to be higher, right? That also means that for people who exercise, like athletes and people who take this stuff very seriously, preload is going to be higher for athletes or for people who ensure that they have fit hearts, right? So the next factor, other than heart fitness and your ability to fit more blood in your heart, which is preload basically, is contractility, right? Contractility is the contractile strength at a given muscle length, independent of muscle strength and EDV, right? You have something called a positive inotropic factor. That's going to increase your contractility. That increases the number of the calcium that is influxing to you due to your sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And you also have some factors here like hormones, thyroxine, glucagon, epinephrine, all those kind of good things that come to your heart to tell you fight or flight response, increase heart rate so we can run away from that bear, all that kind of good stuff. Or because your thyroid controls your metabolism, hey, we need a higher metabolism, we need more energy, beat faster, right? There are some negative inotropic factors. That's going to decrease your heart's contractility, meaning how much your heart can contract, right? Things like that would be acidosis. If you have put yourself in an unhealthy position where your blood itself becomes acidic, that can make your muscle fibers, including your heart, less contractile. So that means they can't contract as easily. If you have too much extracellular potassium, that can happen. This is why occasionally, there's at least one episode in every murder series, be it from NCIS to CSI, Bones. There's at least one episode in every single one of these TV shows, all the Law and Order series, where somebody attempted to kill somebody or did kill somebody by overdosing them on potassium. This is why too much potassium can lessen how contractile your heart is. An overdose can cause heart attacks and that kind of thing. That would not be good. If you have things like calcium channel blockers that's happening in your body, with no calcium, you can't contract your muscles. That would be a negative factor here. Right? So contractility is how strong and how forceful your cardiac muscles can contract without taking into account preload and that kind of thing. You're going to have some things that make them contract faster and better, like an epinephrine shot, fight or flight response, and other things that will be negative, such as if your blood turns acidic, which is acidosis, or increased potassium, if calcium channels are blocked, that kind of bad thing. Right? This also is another thing that responds to either your sympathetic stimulation or parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest, so that's going to want to be a negative factor and slow things down a little bit, whereas your sympathetic is fight or flight. That's going to be positive and want to speed things up. Right? This is why some negative emotions can negatively impact your heart rate and all that kind of good stuff. And positive emotions, they give you that burst of adrenaline, give you that positive heart rate, right? That's how all of this stuff comes together. And now we're going to talk about things like, hypoxia is also a negative one. right? That's not breathing enough. A bunch of good things. So afterload is the third thing that affects all of this. So afterload is the pressure that must be overcome for ventricles to eject blood. So that is the pressure that has to be overcome as the blood is flowing out of the heart. This afterload factor is what you hear about the majority of the time when we are talking about actual major health concerns and problems with the heart. So this is the pressure that ventricles must reach in order to pump the blood through all vascular resistance, right? This means that a number of things will increase the afterload and cause some issues. So hypertension, that's high blood pressure, is going to increase your afterload and that's going to result in an increased ESV or end systolic volume, which will reduce your total stroke volume because you already have high blood pressure. That blood pressure is part of the afterload that your ventricles have to push against and deal with. Right? So hypertension or high blood pressure is a form of resistance that actually pushes back against the heart pumping and causes some issues. That's not good for your overall health. Other things that would affect this afterload would be things like valve damage. Remember we talked about heart murmurs and stenosis? This would affect afterload because this affects how much blood your ventricles can actually get out of them when they are pumping. And if it can't be that much because of resistance, like a blocked artery or stenosis in the valve, so the valve can't close, so stuff is backflowing, you're going to have an increased end systolic volume, which means you have a smaller or lower stroke volume, so your heart is not pumping as efficiently. High blood pressure or hypertension tends to be the first and biggest issue for afterload, but there are a number of heart issues that can affect this, and this is something that we hear about the most and what affects your heart the most when we start talking about problems with your heart and that sort of thing. So if you want to put all of this together in a lovely little flowchart, here you go, this magical flowchart, right? So magical flowchart, we know that we're talking about venous return, filling time for your heart. You're going to have autonomic intervention, hormones that control this, whether or not your arteries are dilated or constricted. And all of this is going to affect preload, contractility, and afterload, which is all going to affect your end diastolic volume or your end systolic volume, which is going to end up affecting your stroke volume. And meanwhile, you have your atrial reflexes and autonomic nerves and hormones controlling your heart rate. And all of this put together magically right here determines your cardiac output, which is how much blood your heart can pump. Right? In this nice little formula, cardiac output is equal to your heart rate times your stroke volume. Right? So we need to know some stuff about this first, right? Here you see Rocky training for his big match, right? He's jogging on a beach, right? Your target heart rate is usually between 120 or 160 beats per minute, so your cardiac output is going to be maintained. The maximum benefit to your cardiac output is exercise. Lord knows I need to get more than I actually do, right? As your heart rate increases from resting to, activity, your cardiac output is going to rise. So, right? As your heart rate increases, if you remember when we just talked about stroke volume, slow and steady good heartbeats allowed time for your ventricles to fill up. That means that if your heart starts to beat faster, it's not allowing as much time for your ventricles to fill, so you're not going to have as much blood in total. So as heart rate goes up, your stroke volume goes down. Right? That means if you have other issues in you, like high blood pressure and that sort of thing, that's forcing your body and your heart to work harder and harder to maintain the same kind of like pressure and like blood flow within you, but your heart is beating more often. Your heart is beating more often, but it is less efficient. Exercise would be the best way to attempt to maintain this and get back control. When you are at rest, right, your heart rate or average heart rate is usually 75 beats per minute, and your stroke volume is normally 70 milliliters per beat, meaning an average individual at rest when you are sleeping or at home vegging out and zoning out to Netflix is about 5.25 liters per minute. Right? Your maximum cardiac output is supposed to be 4 to 5 times the resting cardiac output. That means if we're talking about like Olympic trained athletes, the most heart efficient people on the planet, their cardiac output can reach 35 liters a minute, which is insane, right? Your average individual is not going to be that much. By no means will your average individual be that much. And your cardiac reserve is the difference between resting and maximum cardiac output, right? So this brings us to our first problem, or like your practice problem, right? So how we're going to do this, right? I'm going to read your problem out loud, and then I am going to hum the Jeopardy theme to give those of you that want to work it out for yourself and that sort of thing time to pause the video so you can do your math thing. And then I'm going to walk you through how to solve this problem. If you have any questions, please let me know. I know you guys have to solve one of this and not everybody's comfortable with math. I know some of you are going to be like, oh, this is easy, and like I just got out of Calc 2 because I'm applying for PA school. But others of you are like, I haven't been in a math class in 10 years. I'm just trying to like take these classes so I can do better at my job and get an extra certificate. So like, we are aiming our explanation so everybody can understand. Feel free to just check your answers at the end if you're one of my, like, Calc 2 people. Right? So, here we go. You have a patient that presents to your doctor's office with a blood pressure of 140 over 90, a temperature of 91.7 degrees Fahrenheit. They weigh 216 pounds. They are 6 feet tall, have a pulse of 82, an EDV of 100, and an ESV of 40. Calculate their cardiac output in liters. I'm going to hum your Jeopardy theme now. Do 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 do. Alrighty. So now I'm going to walk you through how to solve this. Right? First of all, you're going to always take a bunch of vitals from patients whenever they walk in your door. Right? That means for the questions the doctors and whatnot are asking, you are not always magically going to have all of the information that you give yourself. Right? So first thing we do is we narrow out the information we don't need because your problem is asking you to calculate cardiac output. Draw a line through that. You did not need blood pressure, temperature, weight, or height of your patient for this math problem. So I've just gone ahead and drawn a line through those things that you didn't need that may have just been extra numbers to confuse you in a math problem, right? So you were asked for cardiac output. We know you're going to need your EDV and your ESV and other stuff for your pulse. Here we go. Other stuff we also know. We know that your heart rate is your pulse, right? So we have the heart rate already. That was given to us with our vitals. We know that the formula to figure out stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So we have the two things we need right here. in order to calculate our stroke volume. And we know that cardiac output, which is what our problem is asking us to solve, is heart rate times stroke volume, right? Looks like we have everything we need. We just need to start plugging in. So first thing we're going to do is stroke volume. So we have our stroke volume formula right here. We're just going to plug this right in. So our EDV was 100, so I'm plugging that in. And our ESV is 40. I plugged that in again. That means our stroke volume is 100 minus 40. And that, of course, equals 60. So our stroke volume is 60. Awesome. Now we just need to plug into our lovely cardiac output formula, right? So we know cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. Our heart rate was 82 because that's our pulse, and pulses beats per minute. So our heart rate was 82 beats per minute. And then we have to multiply that by the stroke volume, which was 60 milliliters per heartbeat. Right? Assume that these numbers, if you are given them in a problem without any variables or units of measurement, is milliliters per beat. Right? So that just means we need to multiply things across. Right? When we multiply 82 times 60, we get 4,920. If you guys remember from multiplying fractions, you have beat on the top of this fraction and beat on the bottom of this fraction. That means the beat is going to cancel each other out, which leaves you milliliters on top and minutes on the bottom. So that means our cardiac output is 4,920 milliliters per minute. But wait, we have one more step to do, because this answer right here is in milliliters and the problem wanted things in liters. Milli meant 1,000, so to go from milliliters to liters, you have to divide by 1,000. So we're going to just move the decimal point over 3 places. 1, 2, 3. That gives us our cardiac output of 4.92 liters per minute. And there you have it. There is your practice problem with calculating cardiac output. Right? And there you have it. That was your heart objective number 15. Discuss the various factors regulating stroke volume and heart rate, and describe each in terms of a mathematical equation. If you have any questions, please let me know. You guys have multiple ways of getting a hold of me. But I hope I have made this somewhat clear for you. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a wonderful day.